Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers, with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damman.
Today's episode is sponsored by Tangina Barons and Associates Television Repair. We know how to get through the static.
And welcome back at long last to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, Season 2. Season 2 is here, appropriately recovering sequels and reboots. I am your host, Ben Siders, here with the other guy, Kirk Damman.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise, as always, even in Season 2.
For those of you who are new, we are intellectual property attorneys and certified geeks practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. And you can find more about this podcast on Twitter at LGGPod. I am at Benjamin Siders, and Kirk is at Kirk DMN. More importantly, we're back.
We're back. Definitely we want to sort of do a shout out to hopefully all of our loyal listeners, hopefully many of whom are still listening and have not deleted their podcasts because of our long break. For those of you who are new, we did have a relatively long break, but go back and review the old catalog. The old catalog is really fun.
We refer to it frequently.
And things along those lines because of the fact that we think it has good content in it. But I think we need to start this episode and we need to discuss our Season 2 before we get into some of the interesting issues related to Season 2s.
Yeah, we had a bit of a longer layoff than anticipated. If any of you follow us on the social medias, you'll know that we announced in July we were going to take a hiatus in August, which turned into a hiatus in September, which turned into a hiatus in the first half of October. But we're back now, and we've got a couple of, structural maybe changes, scheduling changes, production changes.
It's worth pointing out with it. We had this longer layoff than we anticipated, partially because we both got just super busy and couldn't make it into the studio. But a lot of it was also as we were sort of looking at what we were doing in the podcast, what we were hearing back from fans. There were some changes we thought we potentially needed to make, and we needed to figure out how to incorporate those.
Yeah, so number one, we're switching from going every 2 weeks to every 3 weeks, but we've heard you that you like the longer format. So you're going to have fewer episodes, but longer episodes.
Yep, and that was far one of the key things we definitely saw. People seem to like the longer episodes, but the issue we bumped into is for us to do longer episodes, we have to basically record them fewer times.
And it takes a little more preparation, and contrary to how it may sound, we're not actually robots and can't just churn out endless content on demand.
We can turn out endless conversation, whether or not it's anything you guys would want to listen to.
Yeah, we can talk forever, but that's not what you're here for. So you're getting an episode today being October 22nd, if you're tuning in when this drops. And then the next one is, I think, November 12th, then December 3rd, and so on. And we may occasionally pop in for special one-off episodes as needed, but since there's no new Star Wars content coming out for over a year, there's really no urgency.
I think that's another thing of focus as to what we have with it. There was a lot of comment about the fact that we were very focused on Star Wars.
Why wouldn't we be?
And we definitely are, just because I think we're both very much Star Wars geeks. But one of the comments we've also had is to try to focus on other sci-fi content, other geek content. Yep. That's something we are also definitely going to work on, and that's part of the reason why we also think the longer format will be better. It allows us to spend a little more time to research things, to go see movies we may want to see.
That's proven to be difficult. I was looking through what's gone on since the last time we recorded and how many movies have come out, and I'm making a list of what I've seen so we can kind of talk about it, so we can compare notes. I'm I've hardly seen anything. Yeah. I still haven't seen Infinity War.
As bad as it is, I haven't seen Infinity War either, and just, for spoiler purposes, don't worry about spoiling it for me. I already know all the spoilers.
We know what happens. You can't avoid it at this point.
But it's also one of those, and I think that, again, as we're going to talk about sequels and reboots here in conjunction with it, I'm kind of unique in the fact that spoilers don't bother me for the most part.
They don't usually bother me either.
I'll try to avoid them a lot of times just because I like to have surprises, but knowing what it is interesting. And I comment about it as one of the things I used to do as a kid. I actually used to regularly read the last page of a book before I read the book. and the reason I do it is because it was the curiosity was, how are we going to get there?
Well, and I used to do that too, and interestingly, it didn't actually spoil the book, because by the time I got through it, I'd forgotten what I'd read from before.
Yeah.
Or didn't make any sense. And really, with movies too, I don't know if you guys are all like this, but, so my wife and I saw that movie Skyscraper with Dwayne Johnson. We just needed something to go see on date night, nothing else was out.
Well, and you have to face the fact that any Dwayne Johnson movie is good entertainment.
Yeah, I'll go see any movie with The Rock just because it's got The Rock. But, we're sitting down to watch it, and, beat for beat, I can predict what's going to happen in this movie. It doesn't make it a bad movie. It's plenty entertaining. It was sort of an homage to Die Hard. But, there's no spoilers. You know exactly how the movie is going to end. Now, Star Wars is a little different. But even then, a lot of I take that back. Like, the end of The Last Jedi, I didn't really see that coming.
I don't think any of us saw The Last Jedi coming at all.
The heck out of it. And I'm like, oh, he's not really there. So anyway, we've also heard you guys tell us that you'd like to hear more of our thoughts on just nerd stuff generally. You seem to like our book and movie recommendations and thoughts. So we'll try and just kind of talk a little bit more about those things. And the other comment I got from a couple people is y'all really liked the discussion of current ongoing disputes involving geek properties, for lack of a better term. In particular, I had several people say they thought the discussion of the Sabak dispute between the Kickstarter guy and Disney was fascinating. So we'll try and keep tabs on some of those things and provide updates over the course of the year. But you need to be forewarned that civil litigation, even in federal court, can move at a pretty glacial pace. So there may not be a whole lot to talk about.
And again, even if we talk about it, we may talk about, hey, this interesting case was filed. That may very well be that a decision is obtained in 3 years.
Yeah, entirely possible. And the last thing is Kirk's got a lead on a potential guest that we'll talk about towards the end of the podcast. We cannot give his name because he's not confirmed yet. We don't want to get people too excited, but he's a very accomplished law professor that will be interesting to have here. So today's episode, Kirk, appropriately. Actually, we should mention AIPLA because that's coming out this week. So if any of you are going to AIPLA, Kirk, why don't you tell the people what that is?
Yeah, so just generally, for those of you who probably know, anybody who's not lawyers, lawyers have all these things that are basically bar associations, which is essentially what lawyers go and hang out with other lawyers. The big one for anybody who's an intellectual property lawyer, IP lawyer, is essentially two: the American Bar Association's IPL section, intellectual property law section, or the one that sort of dedicated itself to IP law, which is the American Intellectual Property Law Association. Now, obviously, if you're outside the U.S., that's primarily American, though it's a very international group.
Lots of foreign counsel come to these anyway.
Yeah, a lot of foreign counsel come. A lot of people come to see what it is. But definitely, it's very focused on, American practice, if nothing else. But AIPLA has 3 meetings a year. I've been very involved with the AIPLA since pretty much 2001. I've been a committee chair, a committee vice chair. I'm actually becoming a committee vice chair again at this current upcoming AIPLA. Actually, a committee I previously chaired.
Which committee?
It's Committee on Emerging Technologies. Right. And just to give you the idea, again, this is a lot of patent lawyers effectively and trademark lawyers and some copyright lawyers geeking out about IP law at these things. So we talk about all sorts of crazy things. What we do as Emerging Technologies is we try to actually identify technologies that we think are going to be the interesting patent, trademark, and copyright questions 2 or 3 years from now. So to use the example, I've had a number of people come to me and say, oh, you guys should do a presentation on 3D printing. And
that's old school.
Yeah, that's old school. We actually did a presentation on 3D printing 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So our current presentations, like a lot of what we've been doing, we did a large presentation on neural networks and AI just recently. We're starting to do a lot more into sort of patenting of biologics. We're getting very into like patenting and trademark issues associated with things like power storage. So a lot of issues that we see sort of as emerging and upcoming. We do have a big CLE that we're doing as part of it. And unfortunately, I forgot to write down the title, as which we have it over the time window. But we do have a big presentation with, I think, 3 other committees. Big panel sort of going through.
Can you tell us what it's about? Or?
A whole bunch of sort of ongoing issues in conjunction with what's happening, and I think in some sense it's we're a little bit more open in the topic of this. It was headed towards the idea of power structures. That was definitely something we were headed to, but this has ended up a little more open. But it's a lot of good speakers, and I think a lot of interesting topics that are going to be presented. So definitely come see us.
Yeah, so if you're going to AIPLA, come track us down. Or if you met us at AIPLA and you're downloading this afterwards because you met us and took our advice to listen to our podcast, then welcome. I also will be, I'm not actually presenting, but I worked on a paper that's being presented on music sampling in the copyright section. Attorney Michael Sukin, he's one of the nation's probably more preeminent entertainment law lawyers. He'll be presenting on that and discussing Bismarcky. I never thought this far into my IP career I'd be talking about Bismarcky, but it's an interesting story. So anyway, so today's topic is reboots and sequels. It's an issue we've wanted to cover for a while, and it's a weird intersection of sociological issues, of psychological issues, of legal issues. There's a lot of different reasons why we see reboots and sequels and soft reboots and remakes and a lot of these things going on right now. And I thought we'd get into kind of go through each one of those and why that's happening, because they're all kind of interesting in their own right. It seems like, correct me if you disagree, it just seems like nobody sits down and just writes an original screenplay anymore.
Well, I mean, there's an argument that says nobody has done that since pre-Shakespeare, since there's only 7 possible plots that you can ever use in any screenplay. But yeah, I think there's a lot of feeling generally amongst culture right now, and I've encountered in other podcasts I've listened to, other media that you get, that there's this real focus on, we want to tell the same story over and over again through sort of different lenses. Mm-hmm. And we're no longer doing it where it's we're going to, tell, Romeo and Juliet as West Side Story. It's, we're going to literally retell West Side Story, or we're going to literally retell Romeo and Juliet doing something else. And there are, it seems like it's becoming more and more common in what's happening. Again, it's not that we're specifically telling the same story, it's that we're specifically referencing that it is the same story and the same themes. We're just telling it in conjunction of different ways. Now, obviously, some of that, as to where it's come from, we see it in sequels, and the idea, and I think there's an important thing to point out here, is what did we consider a sequel versus a reboot and things like that.
We'll get into that.
A sequel effectively is something coming later, temporally, in the idea, versus a prequel
in the narrative structure. We usually think of sequels as the movie or the second piece of content was made after the first, which is, of course, always true for the second piece of content. But it's when the story arc takes place. Is it before or after the original? Basically.
The story arc is essentially the next logical stage, whereas a reboot is kind of starting over.
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of reboots happen recently. I think the major one, for any of the guys who are sort of, into the superhero movies and stuff like that, is how many times have we rebooted Spider-Man?
Yeah, and that one's interesting. I've never dug into the reasons why, but I believe there are legal/contractual reasons why it took so long to merge Spider-Man into the mainstream Marvel universe. I think there was an obligation, or the rights were held by somebody else, and there was a number of options that had to all be extinguished before. I think Disney has Marvel Studios now, don't they? I think Disney's got Star Wars and Marvel.
They do.
Is
that right? I think Universal had Marvel.
Well, in any case, it took a while before they could make it, and same with the Fantastic Four. There was some option, and what's his name? Roger. I forget his name. A very famous sort of borderline A/B movie director, but made an original Fantastic Four movie that was never actually released. They just, that's the thing with these contracts. You have to make the movie. You don't have to actually publish it, or put it in theaters.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's, there's a lot to be talking about. There are legal reasons why people do reboots and sequels. Specifically, and particularly, I think the idea of reboots and sort of things we encounter with it. One of the ones I always think is sort of the most fascinating, sort of in conjunction with it when you talk about it, is actually something that I haven't talked a lot about on this show, but is actually a subject I'm fairly geeky about. I used to be more so than I am now, which is James Bond.
Oh, yeah.
I was a huge James Bond fan as a kid, and I still somewhat am. Anybody who's seen my car, I have a Spectre Octopus, and yes, it's an octopus, not a Wraith, on the back of my car. It's one of those things to just sort of, people put Autobot symbols and everything else. I happen to put that on.
I just have a bunch of Hawkeye stuff on.
Yeah, it's because you're a sports nerd. But the thing that, sort of in doing that, one of the things that's very, very interesting is that James Bond is one of the first things that actually had reboots. Mm-hmm. When you go back, you had the original Sean Connery, the original sort of James Bond. When it rebooted to Roger Moore, you definitely had some changes, things like that. Now, part of that was because it changed studios. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, created some interesting legal issues, but interestingly enough, they've never really been pervasive. The legal issues associated with the fact that one James Bond movie was made by a different studio than the rest of them is one of those things that sort of hasn't really caused a lot of IP
James
problems.
Bond, and we'll get into this more later in the podcast. We've got a whole section on James Bond coming up. But it presents an interesting analytical question, because what is it? Is it a sequel? I think up until recently, we just said, no, they're not sequels. We're just making another James Bond movie. And there's not always any particular continuity between the two, just the same sort of tropes and themes that carry forward. But now that's different. It seems like they're linking them all together.
But they even started that at the beginning with the fact that basically you interlinked with Spectre, with the evil organization that James Bond is working against, the terrorist organization that he fights against. We have an introduction of those characters fairly early, and there are definitely clear references to the Spectre track, at least with some of the movies. Not necessarily all of them, but at least with some of the movies. And so, that's one that I think gets interesting with it, is how much of that is reboot, how much of it is sequel. It's also, very useful, I think, from this, because it's a very long-running property.
Yeah, how many Bond movies are there?
We're talking that it's well into the 20s, maybe even the 30s now.
They've been making them for decades.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think I own 20 of them, and I own all but the most recent ones on DVD. And yeah, I still use DVDs.
We're all getting back to being Luddites now. Like when I built my house, I'm like, I want Cat 6. I don't want to have wireless everywhere.
I actually owned the original DVD player. When they originally released DVDs, Sony and Panasonic each put out an original DVD player. I owned the Panasonic original DVD player because I was switching from VHS and saw it as the future. I was obviously ahead of my time. I am no longer, since I'm still using DVDs and sort of became attached to the technology.
I still don't have a Blu-ray player or a 4K TV. I just for as much as I'm into technology, I'm always slow to upgrade things.
Yeah, and part of that's just because I find it's difficult to do so.
Yeah, it's a pain.
But yeah, I think what we encounter in conjunction with these things is we see these reboots, we see these sequels. Let's start with sequels. And I kind of want to go there. We were talking just a little bit about the differences between them, but let's start with sequels.
Well, what's the psychological appeal to a sequel? I mean, there's some obvious things that the brain knows what it likes, and it wants to see those things again. And so we see a lot of nostalgia too, not just sequels, but there's a lot like the 1980s aesthetic is really popular right now.
Yeah.
Everything's being set in the 70s and 80s. I think it's because the people making these movies now, that's when they grew up, and that's what they want to see again.
Yeah, they enjoyed some of that technology. I mean, as much as it is, I think there is a lot of revisionist history in the way people remember the 80s.
Because when you're a kid, everything's simpler. Like it's a simpler time. Things are easier. Somebody else is in charge of making the big decisions, and so you only remember like the fun pop cultural aspects of it. You don't remember living in utter fear, of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, some of us do. I mean, we had nuclear.
I remember that.
We had
but when
nuclear
you're a
missile
kid,
drills.
it's this vague threat that grown-ups are in charge of.
Yeah.
I think another reason why that time period is big as a setting right now is that I have a working theory that the internet and mobile phones make stories impossible to tell in an interesting way. Because if you watch a movie now, how do people really communicate? They send each other texts, or Instagrams or whatever it is the kids are doing these days. But that's not exactly cinematic, Hey, let's all get together somewhere. Like, having a bunch of characters turn and type on their phone and having an interesting visual way to portray what's going on to the audience is really boring. Nobody wants to sit and watch somebody else type on their phone. And so if you have them pick up the phone and text, they got to do it in like 1 second. So they send a big long message in 1 second. It shatters your suspension of disbelief, and just a lot easier. And a lot of movies that have conflicts, deal with communication problems and people missing each other. It's harder to do when there's instantaneous communication universally available. So you just take it all away, and set the movie in 1983, and then that problem's not there.
One of the ones that definitely I think you really encountered that with, and I think it's a sort of very universal thing that people were even talking about in conjunction with the early cell phones, is horror movies.
Yes.
One of the key aspects of many, many horror movies is isolation. The fact that there are no resources, you're forced to sort of fend for yourself, and you're generally fending for yourself against something that's much more powerful than you are and very, very dangerous.
And at least in the first part of the film, a threat the nature of which you're not entirely sure of. Neither the characters nor the audience really knows.
Yeah, and I think that's a very sort of staple of horror movies. What you're discovering is that to deal with it, a lot of horror movies went to the past or to the future. They set them in the 1980s, 1970s, or they set them in a post-apocalyptic future where they could say something didn't exist. Is effectively a way to deal with the problem that if we think about it, if you were out, camping with 4 of your friends and, somebody suddenly, wound up dead, you'd all be driving elsewhere, calling the police, doing everything that would basically defeat the entire purpose of a horror movie of making you isolated.
Didn't you send me that video of a bunch of, it was like an ironic, like mocking video of a bunch of teenagers show up at like a creepy cabin? Didn't you send me that? And they're like, we're going to go hang out at this cabin. And they show up and they're like, this place is creepy and gross. Let's go to the beach, man. Yeah. And they just take off. And the next scene is like the chainsaw guy comes out. Nobody's there for him to murder.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, this is, and it's like marketed as the most realistic horror movie ever. This is what really happened. You just wouldn't go.
I remember that video. Yeah, I think I did send that to you. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where for a while there was a real problem of just how do we deal with this. What I think you're also now seeing, though, quite frankly, is I think you're starting to see movies. Again, I think horror is leading the way as much as it is. Starting to now say, wait, we can use the interconnectivity as horror. I mean, and I can't remember the movie that just recently came out, but the one where it's basically if you disconnect from the live video feed, you're the next victim. I
actually don't find those all that compelling. Maybe it's because I understand the technology too well, that the whole, there's a demon in your computer thing. It was like, no, that's not working for me at all.
At the same time, I think if you understand the technology generally of any kind of horror, it doesn't make any sense.
There's a way you could do a horror movie like that. That's more of a psychological thriller, where like somebody becomes crazy by being too immersed in like the internet and whatnot. But that's too boring and probably hits a little too close to home for a lot of the audience.
I think we're getting, again, I think people are investigating the idea of using the modern world much more now. But again, I think a lot of it is, quite frankly, they jump back because there is easier to do things. A good example of it, and it's one of the ones that I sort of play around with, and if you talk about it, is if you go to sort of every modern combat video game, the combat is all based on World War II.
Of course, yeah.
It's even, games which are based upon modern combat are not based upon modern combat. They're based upon essentially combat in
How
World
much
War
fun
II.
is it to fly a drone? That's just like, you're playing a video game where you're playing a video game.
But, that kind of idea is to, I think you bump into that. And it's something we hadn't really realized until now. But again, it's, if you really go and you examine like, okay, how was combat fought in World War II or even World War I, we have much more the idea of, okay, you're crossing the blasted wastegate. That's World War I. That's World War II. That isn't Vietnam. That's the kind of thing with it. Vietnam is a much more sort of, sudden attack, type of thing. And again, I think that's hard to do in video games because it's sudden, it's quick, and it's over. And
there's no strategy
you lose.
Involved,
yeah, there's not the strategy.
The idea behind war video games, the fun comes from the application of strategy to win. The fun does not come from accurately mirroring the experience of being in armed conflict. That sucks. Nobody wants to do that.
Look no further than Fortnite of the idea of what is it accurately. So which has no basis in accuracy whatsoever. The concept of how it works. But is hugely, hugely popular because of the nature of it. Kind of presents this true fantasy world of combat.
Well, there's a strategic element that becomes more and more tactical as the game goes on, I think.
Yeah.
I never played it, but that's kind of just what I picked up.
And again, I actually haven't played it myself, but I've read quite a bit about playing it, just amusingly enough as to what it is. And I've thought about playing it. It's just one of those where I don't think I'd get into it. I get why it's so addictive and why it's so interesting, but to me, like, that's not really the kind of game I want to play.
I can't have fun in the fast twitch muscle games.
That's my problem with it.
I'm too old and I can't keep up with these teenagers. So no offense, teenagers, you're just better than me.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about it before. Is the idea that as getting older, we're just not as interested in Twitch games.
Yeah.
Because I can't do it. I used to be able to do it. I was great at it in Quake.
Yeah.
But I can't do those kind of things anymore. And I also don't have the desire, in many respects, to learn
to develop the skill set
and develop the skill set to do it. Just because it's something I don't have as much time that I'd like to put into it as I would have put into it, back when I was in college or something along those lines. Playing.
Let's talk about some of the legal reasons why we see all this stuff. I think a simple one is clearance.
Yep.
It's just when you go to make a new song or you're going to go make a movie, the first thing the studio or the labels are going to ask is, do you actually have the right to make all this stuff, and are you stealing anybody else's material? And you have to tell them no and give certain guarantees and insurance and whatnot.
And I think the thing that you really bump into with that is what you see is once the property's cleared, it's easy to say it's already cleared.
Yeah, and with a sequel, especially like a remake coming 20 years later, you would think if the original infringed something, you'd have heard about it by now.
Yeah.
So you feel pretty safe making the 19th Halloween movie, which I think is coming out this week.
Or, even talking sort of as I think, quite frankly, a sort of great example of a reboot and really a sequel is Tron. And Tron Legacy, which is technically a sequel. I mean, it's set as a much further future time period as a continuation of the same storyline. It's just the technology has changed. But that's one of those things where you can look at it and you say, it's pretty clear who owns the rights in Tron. I mean, Disney had always done Tron. They could obviously make another Tron. They own the rights and everything that appears in it. And I think that's a lot of the reason why you do see sequels is it is easy.
Yeah.
It's very easy to say I can make a second, third, fourth movie in the same franchise because I own all the rights in the franchise versus if I'm going to do the first movie in a franchise, I have to make sure I own the rights, both in twofold in that, one of which is it truly an original script if I'm doing something original, and if it's not truly an original script, it's based on something, it is based on something else. And again, using superheroes as the example where I've got a comic book character behind, I've got a book character, something along those behind. Can I actually get all the rights I need to do this? And once I have them, and I may have spent a large amount of money for them, and it turns out it's popular, don't I want to continue to exploit that, continue to make more money off of it? Because it's a known formula, I know it works, and I know I can get it.
Well, yeah, you have a baked-in audience, too. I think maybe that's why we also see not only that there's a lot of sequels and remakes, but when there are new, quote-unquote, original movies, they're usually based on a book or on something else, or it's a remake of a foreign film. And I think the same legal concerns apply, that the underlying IP has already been vetted to some extent, extent. You're not relying on a screenwriter to just sit down and come up with something original and not unlawfully copy anything from somebody else. If you're buying something, I'm going to Marvel and saying, okay, sell me the movie rights to your entire catalog. I'm pretty confident, since these characters have been around for decades, that all the legal issues regarding who owns them have been resolved. And just in case, we're going to put Stan Lee in every movie.
Well, but surprisingly, you do bump into some weird ones.
Yeah.
And I mean, the example, like one of the ones that I know came out is the character of Bumblebee. There were issues with Bumblebee as a Transformer versus Bumblebee as a superhero. Because there isn't a Bumblebee, that existed. I think it's in the Marvel universe, maybe in the DC universe, actually.
That
which
sounds like an Ant-Man and the Wasp thing.
Yeah, well, it's appeared in I think it's Teen Titans, but I think it's DC.
Okay.
As story has appeared. Or not Teen Titans, but the DC Teen, I think is where it's appeared. And it's one of those things where you sort of bump into who actually owns the rights to the name Bumblebee, because it didn't start off as a movie character. It's only recently become a movie character, and you have a long-running movie character. And it's already been.
Well, now
through
there's
4
a
movies.
Standalone Bumblebee movie coming out too.
Yeah, and those kind of things as to what you bump into is it's not necessarily as clear as we think some of it is, but there definitely is, I think, a bit of laziness there, and that. It brings us to the next piece, and I think it's an important thing to keep in mind when people talk about sequels, is just because you do own the rights to the original doesn't mean you actually own the rights to make a sequel.
Well, I think there's an open question whether there is such a thing as a sequel right in the first place. Yeah. And this goes back to our character copyright set of episodes. If you look at the Copyright Act, there's nothing in there that says once you make the original, you and you alone have the right to make other stories based on that original story. The closest thing is the derivative works right, which is that the author has the exclusive right to prepare derivative works based on the original. But when we look at the cases, we don't see the courts relying upon that as heavily as you'd expect.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that basically it's been well said there is no sequel right. The copyright does not grant you a right to make a sequel in the copyrighted work.
You can make one. It doesn't grant you the exclusive right. It doesn't expressly prohibit others from doing it.
Yeah, but where you really bump into it, I think, in a lot of sequels, and we've touched on this before, is we need to reuse characters, we need to reuse things which may have copyrights outside of the original work. And that's where you even bump into the questions, and we've gotten into these before. Well, what if I write something set in the universe that uses none of the characters? What if the only character I use is a specifically unnamed generic character?
It's our Rogue One, our first episode.
Yeah.
Could you do this in a way? I mean, that movie didn't even use very many recognizable characters. It threw a couple in.
Yeah.
But you could take them out easily. Take out all the obvious Star Wars, fanboy service, the AT-AT walkers and stuff. You could tell that story in a way that looks like Star Wars and obviously is Star Wars, but doesn't use anything that's ever appeared in a prior Star Wars film. And then the question is, just because it's a visual narrative, do you establish, is there some copyright established in the look and feel of Star Wars? And I think you and I as IP lawyers have both said you shouldn't have copyrights in look and feel.
We even addressed it as that's trade dress.
That sounds like trade dress, and that sounds like Star Wars, the gritty, rugged, dirty sci-fi universe. That's just a concept. Alien did that too, right?
Yeah. And Blade Runner, which arguably did it first.
The ugly sci-fi. So that's just an idea, and you have the idea expression dichotomy in copyright that says you can't copyright the idea, just the expression of it. So how broad is that net cast in terms of what the scope of the copyright protection is on the visual narrative? And going back to character copyright, this is I wouldn't say it's easy, it's a simpler analysis with the character. So take like Superman, appears in comic books, has an appearance. Just because I'm drawing Superman, flying straight up, and the perspective is from his left-hand side, and he's got his right fist raised. Okay, so there's one picture of Superman. That's just one expression. But somebody else can't draw the exact same character in a different pose and say it's a different expression. It's really just the same expression, right? Because it's a visual character.
It's still the same visual character. And actually, that's one of those things that we definitely bumped into. And I think if you go back in the art, there used to be, and a lot of people would argue it's certain cases were wrongly decided, the visual medium versus the non-visual medium, and the fact that essentially visual characters, visual medium gets more copyright protection when it comes to things like sequels and reboots than the non-visual does. And we've talked a little bit about this, I think, even in some previous episodes, of the idea is, did anybody know what these characters really looked like before there was a movie? And the weird part you bump into with it is, again, I think, using like the Lord of the Rings as the example, the appearance is an actor.
Yeah.
We're not talking about a true CGI character. There's a necessary component of the character which is the actor who plays them or the actress who plays them.
I can't go back and forget what Viggo Mortensen looks like and tell you what I thought Strider looked like before I saw the movie.
Yeah.
I knew he was tall. That's it.
And that's the thing. It's very, very hard to sort of separate that from it. But it's also now you've inevitably linked that character to Viggo Mortensen.
Yeah.
And that's not a character. That's a person, who's clearly not that character. And it's one of those things I think you bump into, particularly in science fiction. And, you hear it from actors in science fiction of bumping into, they go to these science fiction conventions and they don't necessarily want to be that role. They want to be an actor.
Yeah.
But they get so associated with that role. And part of the reason I think they get so associated with that role is because these are beloved characters that now suddenly for the first time have a visual depiction.
Well, particularly if you're a sci-fi actor, you're often typecast in these roles, and certain genres you kind of get stuck in them. You don't move far out of them once you're in them. And so people always see you as being these characters because that's what you're known for. I think you and I both been listening to the Cracked podcast.
Yep.
They had LeVar Burton on. I listened to him talk, and even though it's LeVar Burton speaking as himself, I just hear Geordie LaForge.
Yeah, you can't sort of avoid it when you're used to that character. And admittedly, I have to say, some of the things, and both of us have taken to listen to the Cracked podcast, which is one of those, if you guys have
speaking of
other
recommendations,
podcasts,
we both like that one a lot.
One we definitely recommend. But the current issue does have LeVar Burton as the guest, and he's talking about sort of the benefits of reading. And as much as LeVar Burton is a fantastic actor who appears great on stage, he also has a voice for radio. I mean,
he does.
He is
the way
such
he
a
emotes
phenomenal
is
voice
terrific,
on the podcast. You understand why he does podcasts where he reads things and things like that. He has such a phenomenal voice for it. And it's one of those where you suddenly realize why he worked as Geordie LaForge, because it's that voice as much as it's his appearance that really worked with that character.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that a lot of people associate that, quite frankly, with Geordie. I think if you saw him, you wouldn't necessarily associate him with Geordie because his appearance was so altered by the visor.
Yep.
But when you hear him, it's so easy to hear that voice.
Yeah, I mean, because the emoting is the same. That's what the actors bring to the character, a lot of their personality and emoting. And, I think, this is my opinion, I think good directors find, good casting agents, find a way to find the actor who's emoting really brings out the best of those characters.
Yeah. Well, and you definitely have it. And I mean, if you want to go into sort of no further, Harrison Ford.
Yeah.
And the idea of, how Harrison Ford made Han Solo and really made Indiana Jones. Mm-hmm. Many of the iconic scenes of both those characters are ad-libbed.
Yeah. Didn't they originally want Tom Selleck for Indiana Jones?
Can you even imagine that? Who that is, yeah. But I mean, they talk about it as it's, the I know scene in Empire Strikes Back is ad-lib. I mean, it was like a 50th take.
Yeah, where he was just tired of it, tired of repeating the lines.
And then they told him just say what Han Solo would say, if I remember right.
Yeah, and then the gun scene in Raiders of the Lost
it's Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Indian guy, they're in Egypt. The Egyptian guy gets that big curved sword out, and does a bunch of moves with it. Yeah. He just picks up a gun and shoots him.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a fight scene, but I think it was Harrison Ford was under the weather at the time,
and
was just
I'm just going to shoot.
I don't want to do this. Just shoots him. The actor on the other side, of course, looks surprised. That was not intended, but fortunately plays along with it, and it's become probably one of the most iconic scenes in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Because it so accurately defines Indiana Jones' personality. Mm-hmm. Though, which is weird because Indiana Jones' personality, he's an archaeologist.
Yeah, I mean, he's a character that I think, we're really digressing here, but Indiana Jones is a character that I think looms large in our minds because the movies were fun, but the character himself doesn't have a lot of definition, and in a lot of ways, he's sort of a roughshod American James Bond. In fact, I think the whole reason they made the character was they wanted to do a James Bond film, Lucas and Spielberg, and whoever owns the franchise said, no, American directors aren't going to direct a James Bond film, and they said, fine, we'll make our own.
Yeah.
And at that level, I mean, James Bond is also a pretty shallow character from that point of view. And it's the universe and the story and the richness of how it's told and the kinetic elements of it that make it interesting and fun. But going back to the visual appearance, James Bond, what does James Bond look like?
Yep. And that's actually, and again, as we get into James Bond, I think one of the things that's really good, and I'm going to talk through a couple things I think are just interesting in James Bond, particularly sort of from a legal aspect, and some of also where the story has gone. The interesting thing I think you have in James Bond is it's definitely one of the first few characters that is portrayed by multiple actors. And is portrayed by multiple actors without sort of any recognition in the movie that the actor changed. Mm-hmm. especially early on, again, thinking like, Roger Moore, Justin Lazenby, Sean Connery, there's no statements in the movies that the actor has changed, between these, that James Bond has changed person. It's still James Bond.
Like in most modern movies, you wouldn't do that. Like if a character, if a character dies or something, like the Roseanne thing that just happened, they wrote the character out for, because of Roseanne's behavior, but they had to explain it. They didn't just start the story over and move on. Like you have to explain what's going on.
And I don't really say that arguably started with Dallas and the need to bring back Bobby.
Yeah.
After they killed Bobby off and they need to bring him back and explain
Speaking of the 80s.
6 or whichever is entirely a dream sequence, which is kind of an amusing way to write out a season.
Our millennial listeners are all rolling their eyes and saying, why do these people always talk about Dallas when they talk about the
I joke
80s?
About Dallas because I was a kid when it was Dallas. And I wasn't allowed to watch Dallas, but I'd occasionally hide behind my parents' armchair, and they would occasionally forget that I was there.
Oh, my mom watched Dynasty.
Oh, I remember Dynasty. And the other one was Fantasy Island, which I have to admit I didn't understand Fantasy Island until maybe 10 years ago.
I didn't either.
Once I finally understood.
I kind of want to go back and watch some of those shows now that I have an adult appreciation for them, or lack of appreciation maybe.
If you really want to talk about sort of crazy ones our parents watched, how about The Love Boat?
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I think, that was one of the first things you had happen with that. And what's so interesting about it was there really was no change. It just happened, and it just sort of was accepted and just sort of continued.
And not all the actors changed either. Like some of the other actors were the same from film to film.
Yep.
But James Bond changed, and the actors playing the other characters never had that moment where they're like, well, geez, you look different today.
Yeah. And some of the other actors also changed at various points in the course of it, and there was no sort of statement behind it. One of the things that's been interesting is I think in modern things, and I think particularly the most recent James Bond movie, there's now been the hint of, is the reason this happens is because James Bond is a persona. That effectively anybody can be James Bond by simply being given the designation 007, which fits a spy when you think about it, this person is always James Bond, they're always 007. We have no idea who they literally are.
And the same kind of rule can apply to the other characters that kind of carry forward, Q and M, and it can be anybody. It's just a role within the organization as opposed to one specific individual. Yeah,
and the fact of sort of the reusing things and playing around with M, with Q, with now Moneypenny as well, being potentially this idea that these are roles. But I think what we haven't seen happen in those movies yet, and I think it's one of the things that's worth noting, is an express statement that this is what's happening.
Yeah, they've kind of hinted at it.
But the other question with it is do they need to? Is it something where the fan base is just going to kind of look at it and say, no, I think this makes sense as a role? It also fits with if you've ever read any of the James Bond books, because many of them were written by Ian Fleming, but there are other authors who took over afterwards. And actually, many of the more modern movies are not Ian Fleming books.
Hasn't Fleming himself said at some point, like, it's not really my character anymore?
Yeah, I think he is one of the ones that said that. There's definitely authors that have commented about the fact that characters aren't really theirs anymore. Yeah. But the comment I remember is I believe it's Living Daylights is the first movie that isn't an Ian Fleming novel. But Casino Royale is a Fleming novel, yet it occurs much later. And actually, if I remember my chronology right, Casino Royale is technically chronologically the first James Bond movie, or James Bond story. Even though movie-wise it's very deep, and it's actually not set to be earlier. It's still set to be an origin story, but it's kind of set to be an origin story of a new James Bond that does make some references to old James Bond having been around.
Which is also interesting that if you set it up that way that it's a persona, then you can have multiple origin stories in the same contiguous narrative timeline, which is unusual. Then it's not really then every movie is effectively a soft reboot. Yeah, and that kind of thing. The one problem I think you bump into with that, and people have commented about this, I think the problem you have with James Bond right now is we are too focused on James Bond as an origin story. The last 3 or 4 movies have all been origin stories for James Bond. I think that is a very valid criticism as to what it is. I mean, I've enjoyed the most recent ones, but I do get the criticism as to... Do we really need to introduce a new generation of James Bond? Does anybody not know? Which gets to another point, Sans Affair. Yeah. And this is what I think is interesting about James Bond is it's been done so much and for so long that, what happens in every James Bond movie? What have we got? We've got an introduction to the villain. Yep. You've got the introductory... And the villain's usually horrible. That's one of the things to sort of keep in mind about James Bond. Two-dimensional... The villains are usually very horrible. Boring, yeah. You've always got the same kind of jazzy intro music with the abstract art background that relates very loosely to the plot somehow. Yes, very loosely to the plot. And then you've got, the looking down the gun sight thing where he turns and shoots. And then, structurally, they mostly play out the same way. There's a head fake towards one villain that's the false villain.
Yep.
Then there's the real villain. There's an introduction to the story. There's the romantic interest. The same thing just plays out in every movie to the point where it's become a trope. The things that happen in a James Bond movie are now sans affaire for any spy film. You've got the technical guy and the gadgets, the Q-type character.
Yeah.
You've got the obligatory car chase and the guns and the tuxedos, and all this stuff is now spy trope.
Yep.
But so has James Bond, it's created what is now sans affaire for all other spy movies, and you can't copyright those elements of the story, but that's what a James Bond story is.
Although I think one of those things we bump into is I think it's anybody, and again, it's not like I'm involved in espionage, but I think anybody who is probably involved in modern espionage would say James Bond as a spy is totally unworkable.
It's exactly what somebody who was involved in espionage would say.
But yeah, I think it's one of those things where you look at it and you just, even from a basic point of view, if everybody would know James Bond is a spy, he's always been a spy. He's been a spy for 40 years. So if I walked up and said, I'm James Bond, and I'm an important...
James Bond, we're like, so you're the new one, right? Like,
I'm an important government affairs, activity. You would presume he's a British spy. It's those kind of things. And I think there was one movie that even sort of did that sort of pointed out the fact that like somebody recognized that he was a spy just by the fact of who he was. But it's one of those things where you look at it and you say, in modern sort of spy movies, I think you wouldn't have that. And we've seen, and I know we both saw it, we both saw edited, but I saw an edited version of it, you didn't. We both saw Red Sparrow, which I think is a very non-James Bond spy movie.
No, that's a very different type of film.
It's an extremely different type of film. And just for anybody who hasn't seen it, so what it is. Red Sparrow loosely is a story about a Soviet spy agency. The thing about it is a movie which is extremely sexually charged and extremely violent.
It is graphic in every way a film can be graphic.
And it does it on purpose, for a very, I think, important plot point.
It's unsettling. Like, normally a movie like that, you'd expect him to take advantage of, the sexuality to make it more interesting. It's not.
No, it's not. It makes it more uncomfortable, and that's the whole idea. And it's one of those movies that I think the more after seeing the movie, the more I've sort of gone back and sort of analyzed the movie.
I really think
in many respects it's a brilliant movie in the way it sort of portrays the idea and what's going on and things like that. But it's very much not a spy movie as we think of James Bond as a spy movie. And that's good. I mean, it's completely blown the trope out of the water. There's still elements of it, definitely as to what it is. But again, there's elements of espionage which are always going to be common. The secret compartments is something all spies are going to use. I mean, modern spies use
the dead
them too.
drop, all that kind of stuff.
It's those kind of things. As I'm trying to remember, I actually had a presentation that was given to me by a spy on how to catch spies, and I remember I think it's field work. I think is the term they use, or something.
Fieldcraft.
Fieldcraft. That's the term I'm looking for. Those types of things.
I think the interesting question, does the change in actor alter the copyright scope any? Or the strength maybe of a copyright argument? I mean, just going through the sans affaire stuff, I'd argue it maybe weakens it a bit. It weakens what you can say is copying your movie.
Yeah, and that's where you bump into what is James Bond? And we sort of started this whole thing with that question, who is James Bond? What is James Bond? We look at it and say James Bond obviously is not defined by any particular actor. We've had a number of different actors that have played them. Now, those actors share certain commonalities. I mean, let's be the most bluntly obvious ones. They're all male and they're all British. Now there's some reason for that. He's a British secret agent.
Yeah.
But the things that
there's no reason narratively why you couldn't have an American national or like an Indian Gurkha come fit into that role.
Well, we were actually talking about that. I have to admit, like one of the things I looked at and I said, assuming you treat James Bond as a persona, wouldn't it be cool if suddenly James Bond was Indian because they needed to do something in India?
Pakistani. I mean, there's a lot of former British mandates where you could draw actors from.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. The idea that, yes, this is somebody who's clearly British. They can give you a bit of the origin story that they
blend in a lot more places in the world.
Exactly. They blend in, and the whole idea of it's James Bond would stand out in these, being, Pierce Brosnan is James Bond. It would clearly stand out in these types of things, whereas another actor wouldn't, would blend in much better. Wouldn't that be interesting?
It would be interesting. But then you risk the fan backlash, which we're seeing in another sort of polymorphic character, which is Doctor Who.
Yep. And I think we don't talk about Doctor Who a lot, and I think it's because neither one of us is a huge Doctor Who fan.
I've never seen a single episode.
So I actually watched a lot of Doctor Who in seasons 1 and 2, back when the Daleks were trash cans. and things like that. And so the modern Doctor Who to me is a bit foreign.
Yeah.
But we definitely have some friends who are seriously into Doctor Who and things like that. But, again, Doctor Who's another place, kind of like James Bond, where definitely they've now explicitly said Doctor Who essentially is a persona.
As a persona, yeah. Which when you do that, frees up who can play that role. As we see now, we have a female Doctor Who.
Yep.
And if it's just a persona, then there's no reason why it couldn't be anybody.
It couldn't be anybody. And that's kind of the fun thing, I think, in some respects of that.
I understand it annoys some fans, who feel like it lacks some fidelity to the original.
Yeah.
As somebody who's not a big fan of the series, it doesn't really matter to me either way. For my part, I don't like tokenism, but if there's a genuine effort to cast somebody who's good in the role, I don't really care who it is.
Quite frankly, I have to also look at it and say the whole idea that it's supposed to be anybody kind of presents fun alternatives when you start messing around with who is it.
Well, you could have a female James Bond. That wouldn't bother me any. That'd be fun.
Yeah. The other one that they've actually played around a bit with that is Green Lantern. Because, in like superhero things, Green Lantern is whoever has the ring. And I'm not real familiar with it, but I believe like in the comic book universe, there's like a place where Green Lantern's a dog. And like, sort of various things like that, because it's literally by putting on the ring, you become Green Lantern. And, there's a lot of aliens that sort of appear as other, objects and things like that. They aren't human. And there have been male and female Green Lanterns. But yeah, I think but when you talk about the idea again as those sort of things, what does it mean to be James Bond? We really bump into that now of what's a James Bond film versus another spy film? And again, we've talked about Red Sparrow is a totally different type of spy film. There's no question there. But we start getting into something that says, hey, I want to make something with, a spy who's suave, who kind of behaves like the stereotypical bachelor, I think is one of the things you could say, sort of behaves the way James Bond behaves.
Womanizer.
High-10 gambler, or those kind of things. Obviously drinks expensive cocktails.
Say he's sort of a 1950s era alpha male. Highly confident, trim, athletic, good-looking, worldly, knowledgeable, knows, appropriate interests in libations.
Yeah. I think one of those things that you can actually put it down, and I think if you investigate it, it's one of the things that I'm watching right now just as what it is. I'm actually watching the Amazon Prime series on the Hugh Hefner story and the story of Playboy. James Bond is Playboy.
Yeah.
That's what he is. He is, when you watch that thing, the idea of what Hugh Hefner was trying to create as the Playboy image, it's James Bond.
So if we're going to let's say you and I wanted to make just a James Bond movie, but we didn't have the rights to James Bond, how much of what's in those films could you pretty faithfully replicate? Yeah. Don't call it James Bond.
You obviously can't call him James Bond. You can't refer 007.
Yeah, but that's a trademark issue more than you can't copyright James Bond, right? The two words.
Yeah, but it's a clear trademark.
It's a clear trademark, so James Bond is. And you'd have to you have to change the character names around. But the Sons of Fair aspects of it are so entrenched now, I don't think you'd have to change that much to get far enough away that all you've really taken are the tropes.
Yeah. The one problem you potentially have is if you just took the tropes and you took too many of them, you'd start being compared to James Bond movies and probably be found inferior.
Obvious parody, what's the real narrative difference between James Bond and Austin Powers?
Yeah, well, it is an obvious parody. And it's not. It's because it's an obvious parody.
It's a degree of silliness. Yeah. James Bond is fundamentally silly, but it takes itself seriously. Yep. Austin Powers doesn't expect you to either.
Yeah, and sort of things. But you also get into things like the role-playing game Top Secret, which is effectively James Bond, and the stuff you do.
Well, there was that movie James too, A Top Secret. Well, that was that movie from the 80s.
That was another parody, effectively.
It wasn't really a James Bond parody so much. It was more of a East German spy. Yeah,
spy movie parody. But I think
for those of you who are millennials, there used to be an East and a West Germany.
This is something we need to actually put out there. Yes, there used to actually be East Germany, and it used to be communist.
Yeah, and we're not using millennials in a condescending way, but
no, it's one of those. And actually, people have commented about the fact that we seem to stuck in the 80s. A lot of our growth did occur in the we did grow up in the 80s, and a lot of our references are to that just because that's our childhood.
We're actually not that far removed. Like the modern definition of millennial was like born in the early to mid 80s. So like you have no real conscious memory of the Cold War, but you would have grown up, with the internet at least on the tail end.
Well, we've also got to remember that all millennials, I believe, as of this coming June, will have graduated from college.
Yeah, I think
that's the timing, right?
Well, Spencer, so my oldest son is in college right now. He's not considered a millennial. He's considered whatever generation comes after.
Yep.
So, you're millennials now. You sort of think of them as the participation, medal generation, but they're mostly all in their late 20s, early, or 30s, maybe even in their 40s now.
And that kind of thing. We've got the next generation, which, of course, is typical. We're from Generation X. After us, they felt the need to originally name everybody with some letter, which, of course, they then later get rid of. So it was Generation Y became the millennials. Now it's iGen, which I'm presuming is probably going to get rid of the I eventually. Yeah. But those this kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's one of those where there are things about that. And again, like James Bond's a good example. The original James Bond, a lot of his enemies just plain don't exist anymore. I mean, he fought a lot of communists. He fought a lot of East Germany. I mean, there's one where it is a whole breaking out of East Germany sort of, episode. They eventually turned it into the idea of a global terrorist organization, which works much better in Spectre. And that always worked because then it was something they could sort of universally keep, and it could have its fingers wherever they wanted it. And I think that's part of the reason why Spectre hung on, quite frankly, because it is just a useful thing to use as a plot device. But I think you really do bump into the thing that James Bond, as soon as you get away from calling him James Bond in 007, it gets very, very hard.
So
to
Mission
say
Impossible.
What there is. Yeah.
That's another franchise that's going strong. Did you see the most recent one?
I have not seen the most recent one. I don't think I've actually seen anything since number 2.
I kind of have caught them here and there. I'm not really into the series, but my wife really is. So I've kind of seen them because she wants to see them. We went and saw the last one, but it's the same kind of thing. It's definitely stylistically different from James Bond. It's action oriented, and the plot is equally silly in a lot of ways. Takes itself also as seriously, but the way it's filmed and the way the plots are structured, the tropes are different, but they're still there.
Although we're also going to keep in mind that the Mission Impossible films are based upon the Mission Impossible TV show, which is arguably based on James Bond.
Yeah, exactly.
You sort of jump back there. I mean, the only thing they kept is this tape will self-destruct in 3 seconds.
Yeah, they still do that piece.
Yep.
Yeah, the tropes are different, but the movies are fundamentally the same kind of movie. But the same thing. You have the same question. They're going to keep that franchise going as long as they can. If Tom Cruise ever ages out of the role, which at this point seems impossible,
but definitely is possible.
Yeah. So they swap somebody else in. Yep. Does that weaken the copyrights or the uniqueness of the Mission Impossible series?
And we've definitely had this happen a lot more recently. I mean, 24 had repeated sort of the TV series. 24 had switchovers to Jack Ryan.
Jack Ryan, the new John Krasinski one. We saw that too.
We've had him switch over. We're having actors change characters. Again, some of which is conscious reboot, some of which is the idea of it being a trope. Does the concept of saying the character is a persona strengthen or weaken protection in the character? And I'm not sure that's something we've ever gotten into yet.
Well, so the Jack Ryan one, have you seen that?
I haven't yet, no.
So we watched it because, again, my wife's a big John Krasinski fan. Do you see a trend here? We watch movies and shows that feature male actors that my wife really likes. No, we watched that one. I like John Krasinski too. And it's very clear it's based on the character of Jack Ryan.
Yeah.
But other than John Krasinski's character being named Jack Ryan and working for the CIA, I don't see any parallels at all or connections to the series.
Yep.
At which point, it's not even a copyright. You're just using the name Jack Ryan to get
it's really
for
a pure trademark at that point in time. And we get into that with the ideas. I think that one of the other things, we talked about reboots, we talked about sequels. The other thing is, quite frankly, alternative universes.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea where we have things that exist separately. I mean, taking like Thor Ragnarok, out there, which is basically an alternative universe, in Marvel. I mean, I'm not sure it's presented that way in the movie. I haven't seen the movie, but it's definitely in the comic books. It was a wholly alternative universe. It's one of those things where, how does that affect it? Where we now say, yes, there are actually multiple personas, which are all Spider-Man, multiple personas, which are all, Jack Ryan. Again, does that strengthen or does it weaken the protection in the character? I sort of look at it and say, I think there's an argument definitely that it strengthens the trademark. I mean, the name becomes more associated with more things. The brand.
We talk about that with Star Trek. Like the new Star Trek is sort of a different, not your daddy Star Trek kind of approach to it, whereas the Orville is more like the next gen we grew up with. So Star Trek now can be more different things, which strengthens the brand, but then does it weaken the scope of the copyright? Like, how much can you borrow from Star Trek before you're infringing?
Yeah, before you're infringing now, because of the fact that you've sort of moved away from the cores of it.
Yeah.
The persona's gotten a little bit less, for lack of a better term, one-dimensional. It's gotten so many more dimensions now, which parts of you copying. And it comes back to and I believe we've talked about this on the show, it's definitely one of those things that's interesting, is the persona of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And there is actually a copyright case involving the persona of Sherlock Holmes.
Well, that one's important because the copyright straddles the public domain cutoff.
Yes, and that was what the issue was, is that there was a series of books before break and a series of books after the break. At the time they were doing some of the reboots, the copyright in the first had run and the copyright in the second had not. And so the issue with it is what is the character copyright in Sherlock Holmes? And one of the things the court basically said is that elements of the personality of Sherlock Holmes, which existed before the break, were public domain. Those that existed after the break were not.
So basically, if there's a part of his personality that was described in what is now a public domain work, that anybody can use it. And the character himself, just the name of the character can be used. But elements that were developed later, which are still under copyright, would still be protected.
And can't be used with the character.
Yeah, and this is all basically a really complicated, difficult jury question that that every judge hopes he never has to deal with because it'll be a messy case.
In Sherlock Holmes, remember right, the particular aspect of the character is that he's afraid of dogs.
Yeah, the Hound of the Baskervilles.
And it's because of the Hound of the Baskervilles. And so that's the issue of it. So they couldn't make the character afraid of dogs. They couldn't have that aspect of the personality because that's something which was introduced later.
But then could you add a dog scene as homage? Because homage is never infringement, right?
Yeah, but also sort of when you look at that, the idea of the character, you can't make him afraid of dogs. What if he's afraid of cats? What if he's just never has a dog that he encounters? There's never a dog that appears on screen. You don't know.
He's afraid of wolves. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, and I mean that's a case you're going to say, well, it's obvious what you're doing there, right? Like it's not going to pass the laugh test.
Yeah.
But these doctrines get really messy around the edges, especially right now as we talked in our character copyright episodes. It's 2018, and so the cutoff is 1923, I think, is where the line is.
Now, we also have to keep in mind, actually, we should mention on the show the new Music Modernization Act.
Oh, yeah,
which
we
was
should talk
just
about
passed, changing some copyright aspects here. Now, it's music
film,
and not video, but that's something where you have these changes in the law, and that did just alter the copyright scope. So when we're talking about when are copyrights going to expire, what's going to expire, that did just alter some copyright scope in music works.
Yeah, for sound recordings, basically. For musical works themselves, nothing's really changed. But up until 1972, actual recordings of songs were all just governed by a mess of state law and what are we calling it? NAFTA 2.0? Is that the correct name? That's what we call it. It's changing that now.
Yep.
So now it's going to be 95 years and governed by federal law.
Yeah, and there's some interesting
Which
stuff
is long
associated with
overdue.
that. But yeah, I mean, you can argue it's long overdue. There were definitely changes. If it pulls it in line with everything else. But when we talk about the idea of what is coming in public domain, there's always the possibility of that changing in the future.
Yeah.
So we have effects now, which may have effects in the future, which could also further complicate it. You have something which is public domain, something becoming not public domain, now something which was based on it being in public domain. What happens to the copyright in that? You have these kind of copyright questions. And again, that's why we did this episode as our reboot.
Yep.
And did this episode with the idea of let's talk about sequels, let's talk about later seasons, and the fact of what happens in conjunction with these things.
Let's pivot. We could talk about that for 3 more hours, and we have before. We probably will again.
Yep.
So new segment, let's talk about geek stuff. A lot has happened since July, and I thought we'd kind of go through what we've seen recently, what we recommend, what we don't recommend, what we've liked or not liked. So one thing neither one of us saw, and we definitely don't recommend, there was
we may recommend if we saw it, but
there was a Slender Man movie, which I think you and I we did an episode on urban legends, and I think I said something like, I'm shocked there's not a Slender Man movie yet. It's such a stupid idea. But there was one. I didn't see it. I've heard anecdotally that it was not good, so I can't personally recommend it or not recommend it. To go back to our point, why hasn't this been made? My theory was because the copyright ownership is not clear based on how the urban legend emerged. It was sort of a collective thing.
Yep.
This, I don't know how that got cleared up, but my guess is someone sold the rights to the movie studio to make this, and that person gave some very robust warranties and representations and indemnities that they would cover the studio if anybody showed up and sued them over it. And the studio must have decided it's well enough known.
It's unlikely. Yeah.
It's been. I also think part of maybe the reason why it wasn't made into a movie sooner is because there were the Slender Man murder attempts in Wisconsin. Those 2 girls tried to kill another girl. And blame Slender Man. And it may have been a simple case of the studio being diplomatic and thinking it's in poor taste to push a movie out about this Slender Man thing when there's like a real life tragedy associated with it. So as far as I know, the movie's got nothing to do with the actual attempted murder that took place. But
it's based on the urban legend.
Yeah, it's based upon the urban legend itself, which, there's not much to it. It's a scary looking thing people photoshopped into pictures. So not much there. One movie I saw was Searching. I think that's what it's called. Have you heard of that one?
I haven't heard of this, actually.
So it's basically a crime mystery or sort of a suspense film. The entire film takes place on a computer screen. The entire film. It opens up with a guy with like Windows 95, and he's like creating folders and setting up email addresses for his soon-to-be-born daughter. And you see his computer, like he upgrades the operating system over time, and they tell this entire story of his wife getting sick. I'm not spoiling anything. This happens in the first 3 minutes. His wife gets sick and dies, and so he's raising his daughter as a single father, and then and she goes missing, and the whole whole thing is him using his computer and other cameras and whatnot. It's sort of almost a found footage type of style of film, but it is done remarkably effectively. It is incredibly well done. I don't usually like those kind of movies. I think it's just a gimmick usually. This is a little gimmicky, but it is so well done and so well directed and so well acted. It is probably the best movie I've seen this year. It is just phenomenal.
It's interesting we talk about that. That's sort of a movie using the modern tech. We talked about it as to what it was. One I'll throw out there.
Not in a dumb way.
Yeah, I'll throw out there and sort of using modern tech in conjunction with it was when we were in New York a little while ago, we actually saw Dear Evan Hansen, which is, I think, a brilliant musical. I mean, stage musical that makes extremely good use of tech. And the idea of, there's scenes in it where they have something going viral. It literally goes digitally viral on stage. I mean, the stage gets taken over by digital posts. And it's one of those things where it's
cool.
It's a really cool way to do the musical. And it's one of those, I'd highly recommend that for anybody who's sort of into it. I enjoy musicals a lot. I really like live stage shows in many respects.
You and I are both theater nerds, so we have an affinity.
Yeah, we are both theater nerds. And that's one I definitely highly recommend. It's what I'd call a true musical. A lot of sort of more recent musicals are more like operettas, definitely approaching operas in many respects. That is not. The songs are interspersed, throughout spoken dialogue. The songs are, in some sense, interruptions. They are, focuses as to what it is. There is a clear play, a plot in the background of what I call a traditional musical. But it's one I highly recommend. I think it was clear why it won the awards it did.
A side question, would you consider Joseph the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat an opera or a musical?
So I think Andrew Lloyd Webber is the one who basically has the real transition question of, does he write operas, does he write operettas, or does he write musicals?
Yeah.
And that's where it started. I think he should be credited as Cats. That's where it started. And Cats' success is part of why it did what it did. But I think the modern musical has much more music in it. You go back to something like Rodgers and Hammerstein, there's songs, and they're interspersed, in conjunction with it.
It's less than half of the content.
There's a lot of just straight screen acting, whether you see it as a movie, whether you see it as a stage show, that type of thing. And I think that was the default of what a musical was up until that point in time. And in some sense, you can look at it and say that was what opera was. It was just unique because it was in English. And the song structure was more narrative than in many operas where they'll repeat the same things over and over and over again. You go and you watch Cats, you watch Phantom of the Opera, you watch sort of anything else that came out of that, Les Miserables, Miss Saigon in that era. The songs are all very narrative. They push the story forward.
Yep.
And you need the words of the song to understand them. And I think that was a new take, but I think that's also what, in many respects, Broadway has become. I'm not saying it's bad. In many respects, I think it's good as to what it is. It's interesting, but it's also cool to see them going back to what I consider to be a traditional musical structure.
I mentioned Mission Impossible Fallout. I saw that. If you like action movies, it's a good one.
Yep.
I don't think I liked it as much as most other people did, but I also have this. I can't just sit down and watch a movie anymore. Like, whenever somebody makes, I don't know if you've seen these, but they have the fake face machine that will make a rubber mask that you can wear over your face. So whenever they do that, I can't help but, you and I are both writers too. I can't help but notice what they're not showing you, which gives them room to do the double cross later. So there'll be a scene where somebody enters a room and gets the mask machine out and scans someone's face, and then the next thing you see is the person walking out, and you're just supposed to accept that it's the person wearing the mask, but they don't actually show you putting the mask on. So it's structured that way for a reason. So like when things like that happen, I'm like, well, I know where this is going, so I don't probably enjoy those too much because I'm too analytical about it, and that's my fault. That's not Tom Cruise's fault. But it was a good movie, great action, really well done. I saw Skyscraper. It is what it is. It's a 2 out of 4 check your brain at the door dumb action movie, and it's good for that.
But quite frankly, I have to say, and it's one of the other ones that I saw just recently was Jumanji, which also had The Rock in it.
I love that.
And I loved the original Jumanji, and I really loved the reboot. And I have to say that, I really thought it was a great movie. It was great. But part of it's because he does such a great job in the role he's given, which is basically for him to be him, except be an uncomfortable nerd at the same time.
Yeah. So if you haven't seen it, the plot is that this nerdy, straight A student kid gets sucked into a video game, and the character that he plays is The Rock.
Is The Rock.
Dr. Smolder Bravestone.
Smolder Bravestone.
Is a 300-pound, mountain of muscle. And then his best friend, who's like captain of the football team, turns into, what's his name?
Yeah, you're escaping right now.
Oh, I can't think of his name.
Jack Black.
No, not Jack Black. He's the cheerleader girl.
Yeah, he's the cheerleader girl.
I cannot think of his name.
Dang it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we'll come up with it. Anyway, it's excellent. Like, basically, all these characters get put into the exact opposite role. The shy, nerdy girl becomes the kung fu kicking person.
Yeah. Killer of men.
Yeah, killer of men. The pretty blonde who's on her phone all the time turns into Jack Black, like a pudgy scientist. And then just the whole movie is them learning to deal with these new bodies.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go into a lot of depth on that. It's played mostly for comedic effect. But they introduce some tension in the story through that. And it's Kevin Hart.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, the true thing in that, and I said the reason I think that movie really sells it is, quite frankly, The Rock proves he can actually truly act in that movie.
Good. It's well
done.
He
really does. Even though it's a specific role and it's a specific, unique form of acting, he does such a great job of being nerdy.
Yeah. There's a great scene where he hears something and he's like, I'm allergic to everything here. Don't have my Claritin.
Those kind of things. I think that was a sort of great comment with it, too.
I mentioned I watched the Jack Ryan series. Also good. I kind of lost steam towards the end. But it was just sort of a short mini-series to reboot the franchise, basically, and get this started. My wife and I finished The Americans. Have you watched that one at all?
I think I watched a couple of the episodes of it. I thought it was a cool concept, but I never got into it.
The first couple seasons were really good. It kind of dragged in the middle, and then the very last season was really good. Mm-hmm. We kind of got partway through the second to last season and lost interest, and then we heard that it finished really strong, so we came back and finished it. Good series. If you haven't caught that, it's about they're called illegals, which has other connotations now, but at the time they were Soviet spies who were trained to speak flawless, unaccented English, planted the United States, and given a backstory as like a married couple. They actually had kids and lived and worked and then carried out the secret spy life, which apparently really happened, I guess.
Yeah, it did really happen.
It's a story about them and how it's basically a work-family balance type movie, except your parents are spies that murder people. So there's a lot of dramatic tension, really good, finished strong. So if you haven't caught that one, do. The other one I just started, I'm 2 episodes in, is Maniac. Have you heard of this one?
No, I haven't heard of this one.
So it's got Jonah Hill plays a schizophrenic who is part of, and it takes place in like the late 70s or early 80s. It's not clear where, but it's an alternate reality. It's a late 70s and early 80s that has modern social media, but without the internet or cell phones or anything. So one of the characters goes to a liquor store to buy cigarettes, and she doesn't have any money. And she goes, I'm going to pay with an ad buddy, which means that a guy walks up with a suitcase full of ads and reads them to you for half an hour to bombard you with advertisements, and then they pay for your cigarettes for you. And they're like, so you go to the subway, and you just push the button for ad buddy, and here comes a guy and sits on the subway and reads stuff to you the whole time. And there's even comments in the show about how don't do the ad buddy thing. The more that you do that, the more they learn about you, and they'll start really messing with your brain. It's really interesting. There's also a commercial place called Dox, D-O-X, where you can go to and just pay them to blackmail somebody for you. It's all above board, which is kind of like doxing online. So the setting is really interesting and really bizarre. And I'm only 2 episodes in, but it's definitely got my attention. It's I don't want to get into the plot too much because I don't really fully understand what's going on. It's got Emma Stone is in it. She's good too. Really interesting concept. Really, it's the 80s aesthetic again, but then you're transplanting the modern realities of how the modern economy works online into a non-online world. And it's just weird, but it's really got my attention.
That's really kind of a cool concept. Yeah, actually, interesting enough, I've managed to watch a bit of stuff. I've started watching the Clone Wars from Star Wars, the animated sort of between the things. The thing that I'm most of the way through season 1 now, the thing that I think is very interesting about it is I'm actually surprised with the quality.
Is it the animation? Or?
No, the actual surprising quality of the writing. These are actually relatively good plots. They're very short, self-contained. They're half-an-hour episodes, obviously as to what it is. And some of them are a bit jumpy as to the way they go. Between 2 of them, there's no real connection as to why we're going from point A to point B.
Sort of the old syndication model.
But it's one of those things where it's, I think most of them have very interesting plots. They're trying to sort of focus on things. And they're really developing the character. The most interesting character in it right now, quite frankly, is the relationship between Anakin and Ben.
That was the missed opportunity of the sequel. Yeah. We never got to see that develop.
And I've heard from people who said it, and they've said for the fact that it's one of the important really aspects of the Clone Wars, is between Ben and his Padawan. Between Anakin and his Padawan. And that's a very interesting interaction because she definitely shows aspects of his personality, but also sort of lacks a few of the extremes. And that comes across it a couple times. And so it's a really thing where you can see this is going to end badly.
It makes you wonder if maybe the problem with the prequels is it was essentially a character study of a character that's not really that interesting.
Yeah.
And that you'd be better off developing that over the course of a television format.
Yep.
But at the time when Lucas made those, the TV serial format didn't really exist the way it does now, or you could just make a bunch of stuff and dump it, you know? What you talked about before, too, is a whole other topic we should talk about, is how the way digital distribution is changing how we watch TV now.
And there's another sort of one, the other one, so my wife's actually taken to it, and I can't remember the name of the show. It's the one that's essentially using the crowd to solve crimes. So basically, there's a web page, and it's all based upon the things, and they post up things about crimes, and they try to get information.
Is it a
from the
network
crowd.
show? Or is it on
Yeah,
cable?
it's one of the network shows, and I literally cannot think of what the name of it's called right now.
I haven't heard of that one.
But it's a really intriguing concept. It's one of those where anybody who's a true computer geek, you got to take a bit of a step back from the technology, because there's times in it when it's like, wait, they couldn't do that. But it's just kind of a cool concept of the idea of using modern technology. And again, I don't really watch it. My wife watches it, so I see a number of the episodes, and I've been sucked in occasionally of sort of like, oh, what's going on in this? This is kind of an intriguing concept. Like, where's this thing going? But yeah, mostly if I'm going to watch it, the one I would definitely recommend of things I've seen recently, I don't think we've mentioned it on the show, that I saw again on an airplane, is Ex Machina.
That is good.
That movie is in my mind, quite frankly, brilliant.
Yep.
As to what it is.
You forget you're watching the two characters from Star Wars. It's got Oscar Isaacs and Donald Gleason.
Yeah.
And I mean, I kind of thought that would be distracting when I saw it. Never once did it cross my mind.
So the thing that I really commented about that movie, and the thing I really liked about that movie, is one, keep in mind a little bit when it was made and what has come out since then about social media, about AI, and things like that. And it predicted it. And it predicted it very well. And as you discover as you get further and further through the movie, it predicts it in a very, very horrifying fashion.
It's basically about whether a machine can pass the Turing test.
Yes, it's whether a machine can pass the Turing test, but it's also the idea of whether a machine can pass the Turing test knowing it's a machine.
Yeah. Can it convince you anyway that it genuinely feels emotion?
That it genuinely feels emotion. And the way it's presented, the way the movie plays out, the concepts behind it, and the interactions of what does it mean to think.
Yeah, that's good.
Is an extremely sort of brilliant presentation as to what it is. And again, it's a movie that when it's done, you can't sort of stop and go, wait, I feel like I have to watch this again because I missed things.
Yeah.
But that's a movie I would highly recommend. I know it had been recommended to me, sort of repeatedly. Again, I saw it on an airplane, so I watched it.
Did you see the one they made about Turing developing the machine that breaks the German code? What was it called? Enigma.
Enigma, yeah.
I forget what it's called. I think you recommended that to me.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that movie. I enjoyed that movie when it came out. There's some issues and how it breaks the code.
Yeah, I think they overemphasize his spectrum tendencies.
Well, and it's also they have to crush together certain events which occur, in breaking the codes.
You got to do that for narrative purposes.
Yep.
Speaking of Star Wars, there's a new TV series coming out, The Mandalorian, or something like that.
I don't know much of anything about it.
I just saw it this morning when I sat down, and I didn't really get a chance to dig into it.
It may just be rumor for all we know at this point. But
there's also a rumor that Palpatine's going to have an appearance in Episode 9.
Well, the actor's been cast.
Oh, the actor, maybe is that what it is?
Yeah, the actor's been cast. There's been a statement that he's going to appear, I think, as a flashback, as a hologram.
Is it? Okay.
In something that there was some kind of a leak.
Mark Hamill's also cast, so I assume he's going to be a Force Ghost or something.
But presumably, they need to have him as a Force Ghost.
Harrison Ford was cast for Episode 8 and wasn't in it, so
there's always the possibility of just head fake.
Billy D. Williams is confirmed. I'm very excited about that. And Kerry Russell, speaking of the Americans, she was in that. Is supposed to be in the Episode 9 as well, so I'll have to kind of keep an eye on
It'll be interesting to see sort of
that.
what happens with Episode 9 as we switch back directors. What gets kept, what gets changed. How is, and quite frankly, the controversy surrounding Rose? Is there going to be an effect associated with that?
I really hope not. I hope they don't let the outside world seep into the story.
Yeah, I'm hoping
just
they
tell
don't
the story
either.
you want to tell. And
and I commented about it. I think I even said it in the episode right after I saw Episode 8. Like, Rose was my new hero. Like, at the end of it, I loved Rose. I thought she was a fantastic character.
I wish they had more of her.
I would love to see more of her. I think the relationship between her and Finn right now is a little bit awkward. I think it's supposed to be, but the question is where do they go with it?
And some of the things they had her do didn't make any sense, but that's not the actress's fault. The character's fine.
Yeah, and I thought she was a great character. I thought she was a really fun character, and I think it's something you can really do. So
yeah, I thought that was great.
Yep.
All right, well, we're at our hour. In fact, we're over, so we're gonna move along. So plans for the next couple of episodes aren't completely firmed up. We do have an outline spec'd out for the next one, but whether this is actually the next episode or comes later, the order we're not sure of. But we are going to talk at some point about football. Nerds, don't tune out.
Yes, don't stop, nerds.
Don't
this
tune
is
out.
not a.
This may not sound like a geeky topic, but we're going to nerd it up. And anyway, I would argue the line between jock culture and nerd culture is just about gone now. I'm really into like college sports and whatnot, and the nerdiest people I know are sports fans.
Well, and part of this, quite frankly, is fantasy.
It is.
The fact that we have now changed sports viewing from viewing an actual sport to it. And the thing, if you guys haven't encountered it, it's one of the ones, and I know we're going to talk about it in the next episode. I'm sort of fascinated with this idea of Your Play Football, if you guys know that app, which literally allows you to be a coach of a real football team that is playing a real game.
Yeah, that's going to be cool. We'll get into that. Yeah, so, I mean, if you're into sports at all now, you know that the big sports fans are really into, like, the analytics and the data and whatnot. I never thought I'd see the day where the most math-competent people I know are all the sports people, but that's where we're at. So we're going to talk about video games, actually. More specifically, a video game you can no longer buy due to legal disputes, I think originally over rights of publicity, and it morphed into sort of an antitrust type of case. So that's coming up next, and then at some point we're also going to try to get our IP law professor on to talk about. We're not sure what we're thinking, maybe big data issues. We'll kind of let him decide what he wants to talk about.
Yep, but so that's the thing, and we're definitely looking at the idea. We know our guest episode was popular last year. We're looking at trying to bring some more guests. That's one of the areas definitely for people to comment. If you have topics you would like to hear something about, particularly if you think it's something where a guest would be valuable for us to bring in that's an expert outside of our expertise, definitely let us know that in comments on social media, stuff along those lines. We'd love to potentially do that, as well as if we are starting a new season. We have a whole blank slate in front of us. We have a list of potential shows, the length of our arm. But if there are particular things you would like to hear more about, please let us know. One, because we may be able to incorporate that into a show we're already designing, or quite frankly, if we think it's interesting enough, we may just create a show around it.
Yeah, or if you've got prior topics we covered, I think our first maybe dozen episodes were a lot shorter. I think at the end of a lot of those we said, well, we could talk about this for another hour. We may yet go back and do that. So there's a lot more to say. All right. That's it for today. There's the music. It's time to go. If you have questions, comments, topic ideas, criticisms, complaints, remarks, adulations, or rants, you can send your thoughts to us on Twitter at LGGPod or email us at lggpodcast@gmail.com. You can also talk to us on our Facebook page. Search for Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy and find us there. Subscribe to this podcast on one or more of the platforms. We are on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and other places where you can get your podcast content. If you like what you hear, please give us a review. Reviews are a great way for others to find us. They help with the search engine optimizations and all those sort of things. As you said at the beginning, you can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Siders, and Kirk is at KirkDMN. That's all for today. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded at Cool Fire Studios in St. Louis, Missouri.